we're starting chapter 8, and our first lesson is going to be all about how we go back in our accounting cycle and record our adjusting entries. So make sure that you've either printed or opened your notes so that you can follow along and fill them out. The first thing we're going to go through is this flow chart of accounts again. So remember, this is taking a look at the entire accounting cycle and what we've done up to this point. The very first thing we learned how to do was to put our transaction entries into a journal, and we did that by separating each one into debit and credit. From the journal, we took the time to create a chart of accounts, and we were listing all of our accounts in a specific order. Once we had the chart of accounts where we had all of our account numbers and our account titles, we could start taking the information that was put in our journal and posting that to the individual general ledgers for each account. From the general ledger, we took the balances and we created the worksheet, again listing all of our accounts, their balances first in the trial balance column. Then we moved on to the adjustments column where we had to record any changes we had in supplies or prepaid insurance as adjustments. We then extended our balances onto our income statement column and our balance sheet column. And those were used to create our final box in the accounting cycle, the financial statements of, guess what, the balance sheet and the income statement. So at this point, we've finished our entire accounting cycle, but we do have to go back and do something with those adjusting entries. Now, if you can't remember way back to chapter 6 when we did adjusting entries, those looked like this, and they were the changes that we recorded in our worksheet to update our accounts, specifically supplies and supplies expense and prepaid insurance and insurance expense. So it worked where at the beginning of the year we bought so many dollars worth of supplies, and at a certain point of time in our accounting cycle we may have only used a specific amount of those supplies but not the full amount, and so we had to create an adjustment of the amount of supplies we used, or the same thing goes for insurance, and record that in the adjustments column. So this was originally found in the worksheet adjustments column, which if we quick look back at our accounting cycle is halfway through. So we actually need to go backwards and make sure that we journalize our adjusting entries. And to do this, we're going to create a brand new journal page. And then after we journalize, we have to finish out that other remaining box where we post our journal entries to the general ledger. So we're going to take a look at how we journalize each of these adjusting entries, and what's really cool is we already know how to journalize, so this should be pretty simple. The first thing is that we'll always create a brand new page for these adjusting entries, and we'll start by writing a heading on that journal page that says adjusting entries. So down here on the journal, I want you to go ahead and write adjusting entries. That'll be centered. And then we journalize just like normal. We're going to start with our date. So if we take a look at this worksheet, the date is for the month ended of August 31st. So we're going to go August 31st. And we always do our debit first in the journal. So if I'm looking at this, my first account title is supplies, but that's a credit. So I'm going to skip it and I'm going to find the first debit. So supplies expense is a debit. So I'm going to start with my supplies expense. I'm going to write supplies expense. And in the general column, I'm going to write the amount supplies was. So I'm going to put debit of $715. And then I have to have a matching credit to go with my debit. And so if I look back up, supplies was the credit. So I'm actually going to put supplies on my second line and credit that for $715. So we've got a debit and we've got a credit. And then I'm ready to move on and do the same thing with my only other adjusting entry, which was prepaid insurance. Again, I'm going to start with my date, so the 31st, and I'm listing my debit first. In this case, the debit is insurance expense, so I'm going to write the insurance expense and the amount from the worksheet. And then I'm going to list my credit of prepaid insurance. So for both of these, I've just recorded the debit and the credit, and I've made sure that the debit's first. Now that we've completed this box in our accounting cycle, we need to move on to the last box, which is posting from our journal to the general ledger. So when we post The very first thing we're going to do is write the date down. And the first one I'm going to look at is supplies expense, since that's the first line on my journal. So I'm going to write down August 31st. Then I'm going to look at the post reference, and I'm going to say that, hey, this information is being posted from this specific journal page. And so the journal page that I'm on is page 3. So that's my first line of my X. And then I'm going to bring down, was supplies expense a debit or was supplies expense a credit? Supplies expense was a debit, so I'm just copying that number of 715 down into the debit of 715. Then I need to fill out the balance of my supplies expense. And if I have a debit and a debit, I'm going to put my answer in the debit column and add the two numbers together. If I have a credit and a credit, I'm going to put my answer in the credit column and add the two numbers together. And if I have a debit and a credit, I'm going to put my answer in the column with the bigger number and I will subtract the two. Right now, I don't have any number in there, so I'm going to assume that it's a debit of 0 and a credit of 0. In this case, I would take 0 plus 715, the current debit in supplies expense, and I've got a debit and a debit. So I'm going to add them together and drop that number into the debit column. So 0 plus 715 is 715. The last step in posting, if you recall, is to cross out the X. And that means that we take our account number on our general ledger and we need to put that in the post reference column of the journal. So if I'm looking at the journal, I'm going to be like, oh, this information is posted to account number 540. And that's going to fill out supplies expense. Then I would go down, I'd do the same thing with supplies. So I'd write my date, which is the 31st, my post reference coming from from page 3. Supplies is a credit, so I'm going to copy the credit down into the credit column, 715. And here's where this is an example of there's a pre-existing balance. So the pre-existing balance was a debit, and my current number is a credit. So if I look over here on my cheat sheet, I see that if I have a debit and credit, I'm going to put my answer in the column with the bigger number, and I'm actually going to subtract. So in this case, I'm going to take my number 963, which was the old balance, and I'm going to subtract this current credit of 715. I'm going to get 248, and that's going to go in the bigger number column. So the bigger number here was the debit, so I'm going to take 248 and I'm going to put that balance in the debit column. Last step is to take my account number from my general ledger and put it up in the journal's post reference. So my supplies account number is 140 and I'm going to drop that number into my supplies post reference. So you would also post your insurance expense into the insurance expense ledger and your prepaid insurance into the prepaid insurance expense ledger. So now we're going to do 8.1 working together. Make sure you open that up on Applia and you will need the instructions. It's going to give you the worksheet and it tells us that we want to use page 4 of the journal to journalize and then post our adjusting entries. So if we take a look at the worksheet, the only thing we're concerned with right now is the adjustments column because we're doing the adjusting entries. And on our journal, the first thing we actually want to do is say that's what we're doing. So we're going to head this adjusting entries. Then we can write down our date. The worksheet says for month ended July 31st, so I'm going to write July 31st. And now I'm ready for my first adjusting entry. Always, 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 always start with our debit. Now, if I look at the adjustments column on the worksheet, there are also little A's and B's next to our adjustments. We want to start with the first letter of the alphabet, which is A. So I am looking for the A, and then I am looking for the debit of the A. So if I'm in the debit column and I scroll down, this is B, so I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to go to A, which is supplies expense. So I'm going to start with supplies expense, and I'm just copying the debit over. It was 713, so I'm going to type in 713. I need to do the corresponding A, and this time it's a credit since I did the debit. So I'm going to be in my credit column. Here's my corresponding A for supplies. So I would type out supplies. I've already got my debit. This should be a credit, 713. Now I can move on to my next letter of the alphabet, which is B, and I again put my date of the 31st. My first debit is insurance expense. So I'm going to write insurance expense. The debit is $300, and then the corresponding prepaid insurance is going to be my credit of $300. And that's a simple journalizing. Now we need to take and post these entries from the journal into the general ledger. So my first line here is supplies expense. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to open up my supplies expense ledger. I'm going to start with my date, July 31st. These come from page 4 of the journal. That's where they're posted. So I write page 4. Supplies expense was a debit. So I'm going to copy that down into a debit. Since there's no balance previously recorded, I'm going to assume that it's 0. So I'm going to take 0 plus 713. I'm going to get, wow, 713. And I'm going to place that in the debit column. So 713. I need to take my 540 account number and put that in the journal's post reference because I'm saying this supplies expense is posted to account 540. I'm going to go down the line and do supplies next. And I'm going to write my date, the 31st. This post is on page 4 of the journal. Supplies was a credit, so I'm going to copy it down into the credit column. Here's an example where I have an existing balance of $963 of a debit. I have a current credit of 713. They are different, so I will subtract 713. I get 250. I'm going to take that 250 and put it in the column with the bigger number. So that's the debit. So I'm going to go 250. And then I'm going to take my account number for supplies and say in the journal, this information is posted to account ledger 140. Open up insurance expense, our next account, on July 31st. Page 4 of the journal. Insurance expense is a debit of $300. Again, here's where I take that 0 plus 300. Wow, debit plus a debit is a debit of 300. Take 520 now that we've posted that, and make sure you record that in the journal. Finally, we'll end with prepaid insurance from the 31st. I'm on page 4 of the journal. Prepaid insurance was a credit, so I'm going to write down the credit of 300. And again, I have opposite accounts, a debit and a credit. So I'm going to take the existing balance of $1,200, subtract 300, and I get 900. It goes in the bigger column, and debit was bigger, so I'm going to put 900 in the debit and take my account number and post-reference that in the journal. And if you check, that takes care of journalizing and posting your adjusting entries. At this time, you need to complete the 8-1 on your own and the 8-1 application problem, both of which are on Applia, and then you can go ahead and do the 8-1 EOLR on Schoology.